In a close-knit town where everyone knew each other's name, one careless act of prejudice at a small diner would ignite a storm no one saw coming. The longtime owner believed he was simply enforcing his will, but in truth, he was making the gravest mistake of his life, turning away a man who carried more weight than anyone could imagine. And what began as a single act of cruelty would unravel the town's deepest biases, forcing its people to confront who they really were. John Carter, weary from years that had carved pain into his bones, eased himself out of his old pickup. The southern heat pressed down like a heavy blanket, but he didn't mind. He'd fought in worse places. With a faint smile tugging at his lips, he looked up at the weathered sign, Tom's Diner. For decades, it had been his sanctuary, a place of comfort, good food, and friendly laughter. The door swung open, bells chiming their familiar tune. The scent of frying bacon and freshly brewed coffee wrapped around him, awakening his hunger. He moved slowly toward the counter, nodding at the regulars. Yet instead of returning smiles, he felt the air shift, the chatter fading, replaced by a hush that seemed to close in around him. Eyes followed him, too sharp, too cold. His instincts, honed in battle, whispered that something was wrong. From the kitchen emerged Tom Harris. It's the man who'd owned the diner for years, a man John had once called a friend. But today, Tom's face bore no welcome. His jaw was tight, his gaze like ice, fixed on John as if he were an intruder. "What can I get for you?" Tom's voice was flat, stripped of its usual warmth. John offered a gentle smile, ignoring the chill in Tom's tone. "The usual, Tom. Coffee, and a slice of that apple pie of yours." But Tom's knuckles whitened as he gripped the counter. His words came out clipped, deliberate. "Not possible, John. We're out of pie." John blinked. Just behind Tom, a golden brown pie sat cooling on the counter. The lie was obvious, but before he could speak, Tom snapped, "I said we're out." His voice rose, startling the room. "In fact, we're closing early. You'll have to leave." The diner fell silent. Forks stilled midair. Chairs squeaked uneasily. John froze, his heart sinking as confusion and hurt crashed over him. Never, not once in all his years, had he been treated this way inside these walls. Slowly he rose, his hands trembling. "Tom, did I do something wrong? Have I offended you somehow?" Tom's lips curled into a sneer, his words laced with venom. "You've done enough just by walking in. I don't serve your kind here. Now get out before I call the police." The words hit harder than any blow John had taken in war. For a moment, he was thrown back in time, 2 younger days scarred by injustice, by the sting of hatred he thought had long faded. But this wasn't a stranger. This was Tom, the man he'd trusted, whose diner had felt like home. John's shoulders slumped. Without another word, he turned toward the door. But before he could step out, a young woman at a corner booth rose, her voice trembling. "This isn't right," she said, her face pale, but her eyes fierce. "You can't treat him like this." Tom whipped toward her, rage burning in his cheeks. "This is my diner. I'll run it how I see fit. Don't like it, leave." Fear flickered across her face. For a heartbeat, she stood firm, then slowly sat back down, shame shadowing her eyes. She watched helplessly as John shuffled out, the door closing softly behind him. The room erupted into whispers. Some customers hurried to settle their bills, unwilling to stomach what they'd witnessed. Others stayed rooted in place, stunned, or silently approving. But none of them knew what Tom had just set in motion. Because John Carter wasn't just any man. He carried a past, connections, and influence that reached far beyond this little town. And Tom Harris, blinded by prejudice, just lit the fuse of his own downfall. The tidal wave was coming in when it crashed, would shake the very soul of the community. As John Carter made the slow walk back to his truck, his chest felt heavier than his weary legs. The sunlight that had seemed so warm and kind earlier now mocked him its brightness, only exposing the cruelty he had just endured. Sliding into the driver's seat, his hands trembled violently against the steering wheel. He sat there for a long while, staring blankly through the windshield, the humiliation washing over him in relentless waves. But then, something inside him shifted. His jaw tightened. His eyes, moments ago clouded with hurt, burned with resolve. John Carter had endured too much in his lifetime to let this break him. He was many things: a veteran, a father, a respected man in his community, but never someone who bowed quietly to injustice. As his engine roared to life, his mind was already racing. Tom Harris may have shoved him out of that diner, but the battle was far from over. Back inside, Tom Harris braced himself against the counter, scowling to mask the unease gnawing at his gut. A handful of regulars had left in disgust, their stares like daggers on their way out. Still, Tom stood his ground. Told himself he'd done what was right, what his father would have expected. But the truth bled through in the pit of his stomach, a sour, twisting dread he couldn't ignore. By sundown, the incident was no longer confined to 4 diner walls. The town buzzed with whispers, neighbors clustering on porches and street corners. John Carter wasn't just another customer. He was known, respected, loved, and the idea that Tom, a man long believed to be fair and friendly, harbored such venom left the community shaken. But there was one man whose reaction eclipsed all others. Hundreds of miles away in Washington, D.C., Michael Carter sat in his office, papers stacked around him, when his phone rang. The voice on the other end, an old family friend, it counted the ugly scene at the diner. Michael's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles went white. Michael Carter wasn't just John's son. He was a U.S. Senator, a leader renowned for championing civil rights and veterans' causes. For years, he had battled injustice on a national stage. Now that same darkness had struck his own father. The irony wasn't lost on him, it ignited something fierce in his chest. For a moment, he imagined unleashing the full weight of his power. Laws, headlines, investigations. He could crush Tom Harris without lifting more than a pen. But Michael knew brute force rarely healed wounds. It deepened divides, hardened hearts. This fight called for something more deliberate, something that would not just punish but change. He leaned forward, picked up the phone again, and began making calls. Quietly, precisely, he set the pieces in motion. Tom Harris had no idea what storm was gathering. The next morning, the town awoke under a brilliant sun, but the light only revealed the storm brewing beneath. Outside Tom's diner, a small group had already gathered, clutching handmade signs. No to racism. Equality for all. Their voices were calm but firm, presence undeniable. Tom's face flushed red as he shoved past them. Fumbling with his keys, his hands betraying a faint tremor.
Nice.
Once inside, he tried to slip into his routine, but each chime of the doorbell made his chest tighten. He half expected John Carter, or worse, the police, to appear at any moment. Hours passed, and when nothing happened, his confidence began to creep back. Perhaps, he thought, the storm would pass. Asterisk, but then the bell above the door jingled again. Tom glanced up and froze. A man he didn't recognize stood framed in the doorway. Tall, immaculately dressed. His posture carried an authority that made the entire room take notice. He didn't need to raise his voice or demand attention. His presence alone commanded it. The stranger walked steadily toward the counter, his eyes sweeping the diner before fixing squarely on Tom. "Are you Tom Harris?" His voice was calm, steady, but with an edge sharp enough to cut steel. Tom swallowed hard and nodded. "I'm Michael Carter," the man said, his gaze unwavering. "John Carter's son, and we need to talk about what happened here yesterday." Tom's blood ran cold. He'd heard whispers that John had a son in politics, but he had brushed them off as idle gossip. Yet here he was, standing in his diner like a shadow out of legend. Tom stiffened, forcing his pride to the surface. "Listen," he barked, his voice gruff. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is my establishment. I have the right to refuse service to anyone I please." Michael's expression barely shifted, but his eyes gleamed with a dangerous fire. "Is that so?" he asked quietly. "And on what grounds did you deny service to my father, decorated veteran? A man who's lived in this town longer than you've been alive." Tom's face flushed crimson, his prejudice spilling past the point of no return. "I don't have to explain myself to you. Your father and people like him aren't welcome here. That's the end of it." A hush descended. Every patron in the diner leaned in, hearts pounding, unable to look away. Michael Carter stood perfectly still, his stare locked on to Tom's face. When he finally spoke, his words were low, deliberate, and brimming with restrained fury. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." "Asterisk, Mr. Harris," Michael said evenly, though steel-edged every syllable. "I had hoped we could have a rational discussion, but it's clear now that won't be possible. So let me make this plain. What you did yesterday wasn't just cruel and shameful. It was illegal. I intend to use every resource at my disposal to see that you face the full weight of those consequences." For the first time, Tom's bluster faltered. His eyes darted nervously as he stammered, "You can't do anything to me. This is my business, my rules." Asterisk, Michael's lips curled into a cold, mirthless smile. "Oh, Mr. Harris," he said softly, "you have no idea who you're dealing with. I'm not just John Carter's son. I'm a United States Senator. I've spent my entire career dismantling exactly the kind of hatred you showed yesterday." The words struck Tom like a thunderclap. His skin drained of color. He had thrown out the father of a U.S. Senator. This U.S. Senator, a man who had the power to make his life a living nightmare. Michael leaned closer, his voice low but cutting like a blade. "This isn't over. You'll be hearing from me again, very, very soon." And then he turned, his polished shoes clicking against the tile as he strode out. The door swung shut behind him. For a long beat, silence reigned in till the diner erupted into whispers. Tom stood rooted in place behind the counter, frozen by the realization of what he'd done. All his life he'd clung to his father's warped teachings, convinced he was honoring some kind of principle. But staring into the abyss of what lay ahead. For the first time, he questioned whether those beliefs were worth the ruin they now threatened to bring. What Tom didn't know was that Michael Carter's visit had only been the opening act. The wheels of justice were already in motion, and Tom's world was about to collapse in ways he could never have imagined. This sleepy southern town was about to become the epicenter of a storm that would rip away the mask of respectability and expose the ugly truth beneath. Outside, Michael's stride was unflinching as he reached the curb. He pulled out his phone and spoke quietly into it. "It's done. He's as stubborn and as rotten as we expected. Time to move on to phase 2. Inside, Tom's hands shook as he tried to pour coffee. The cup overflowed, hot liquid spilling across the counter. His heart hammered in his chest, the weight of Michael's words pressing on him like a vice. He had always thought of himself as a good man, a leader in the community. Now, under the harsh light of truth, doubt gnawed at him, relentless and merciless. The hours dragged by like years. With every chime of the diner bell, Tom flinched, half expecting agents, lawyers, or worse to burst through the door. But nothing came. Nothing loud, at least. Instead, the punishment was quieter. Crueler regulars who had once filled his booths were suddenly absent. Those who did walk in avoided his gaze, their smiles forced, their conversations hushed. The diner no longer buzzed with laughter and chatter, it sat heavy with silence, every fork scrape and chair squeak echoing like judgment. Tom could feel the stares, hear the unspoken condemnation in the stillness. By nightfall, he sat slumped in a booth, head in his hands. The once bustling diner was nearly empty. For the first time, he let the thought creep in. Maybe I've made a terrible mistake. Meanwhile, across town, John Carter sat in his modest living room surrounded by the relics of a life lived with dignity. His eyes lingered on a framed photo he and Margaret, his late wife, smiling on the day he returned from war. They had looked so young, so certain the future would be brighter. "Oh, Margaret," he whispered, running a trembling finger across her face. "What would you say if you saw all this now?" A crunch of tires on gravel pulled him back. A moment later, the front door opened, and Michael stepped inside. Father and son embraced, the unspoken ache of recent days weighing heavy. Between them, how did it go? John asked once they'd settled into their chairs. Michael's jaw tightened. About as well as we expected. He won't change his mind, Dad. Not easily. But don't worry. We have a plan. John exhaled slowly, his voice low with lingering disbelief. I never thought it would come to this. Tom and I, maybe we weren't friends, but I thought there was respect between us. To learn that all this time he saw me as less than human, just because of the color of my skin. His voice broke. It hurts, son. It hurts more than I care to admit. Michael leaned forward, gripping his father's hand with a strength born of conviction. I know, Dad, and that's why we can't let this go. This isn't just about you, it's about everyone who still faces this kind of hate every single day. We have to stand up for you, for them, for what's right. John studied his son, seeing in him the fire that once burned in his own youth. A fierce pride swelled in his chest, tempered with sorrow. This wasn't the world he had hoped to leave behind. But perhaps Michael was the one who could finally change it. What's the next step? John asked, his voice steadier now. Michael's eyes glimmered not just with determination, but with the weight of a plan already set into motion. Well, Dad, that's where things get interesting, Michael said, his tone low, deliberate. I've been doing some digging, and it turns out our friend Tom is drowning in debt. His diner isn't the success he pretends it to be. In fact, he's been quietly trying to sell it for years. John's brows lifted, his voice edged with disbelief. Sell the diner? That place has been in his family for generations. Michael nodded slowly, almost savoring the revelation. Exactly. Which is why he's clung to it for so long. But after yesterday's stunt, I think he's finally vulnerable. With the right push, at the right price, Tom Harris may not have much of a choice. John leaned back, studying his son with wary eyes. What are you planning, Michael? Faint smile curved Michael's lips, equal parts determination and mischief. Let's just say Tom Harris is about to receive an offer. He won't be able to refuse. When the dust settles, his precious diner won't be remembered as a monument. To his family's legacy, it'll stand for something far greater, something new. That night, shadows stretched long across the small town. The seeds of change had been planted. And while Tom Harris slept fitfully haunted by visions of angry mobs, lawsuits, and ruined forces were already moving against him. The dawn would bring a reckoning he never saw coming. The next morning, Tom arrived at the diner earlier than usual. His hands trembled as he slid the key into the lock, his mind still fogged by nightmares. As the door creaked open, he noticed something unusual, a thick envelope lying on the floor. Pushed under the door in the dead of night, a chill raced down his spine. Picked it up, tore it open, and froze. Inside was an official-looking document. His eyes scanned the lines, his face blanching with each word. It was an offer to buy the diner for nearly twice its market value. The proposal was anonymous, funneled through a law firm Tom didn't recognize. At the bottom, a note was scrawled in cold precision. This offer is time-sensitive. Acceptance is contingent upon your immediate departure from the premises and a binding agreement never to open another. Business in this town? Tom's mind reeled. Who would make such an offer and why now? The timing was too sharp, the conditions too specific, yet as much as he hated to admit it, the diner had been bleeding money for years. Selling had crossed his mind more than once. But his pride and his father's shadow had always kept him anchored. Asterisk now. Standing on the brink of public backlash after humiliating John Carter, this offer felt less like a trap and more like salvation. And yet, a voice deep inside whispered that something about it was dangerously wrong. The bell above the door jingled. Tom shoved the letter into his pocket just as Sarah, his longtime waitress, walked in. She froze at the sight of his pale face. Tom, you look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine, he said quickly, voice rough. Just got a lot on my mind. Sarah's eyes narrowed, concern mixing with disappointment. About yesterday, Tom. What you did to Mr. Carter, it wasn't right. People are talking. Some are saying they won't come back here. Anger flared hot in Tom's chest. My diner. I'll serve who I damn well please. Sarah flinched at his tone. Regret hit him instantly. He dragged a hand through his thinning hair, suddenly feeling the weight of every year etched into his body. "I'm sorry, Sarah, I didn't mean to snap. It's just everything's falling apart, and I don't know how to stop it." Her expression softened, but her voice stayed firm. "Maybe you could start by apologizing to Mr. Carter. It's not too late to make things right." Tom's jaw tightened. The thought of bowing his head to John Carter clawed at every prejudice his father had instilled in him. For decades, that voice of bitterness had ruled him. But now, for the first time, he found himself wavering. The diner sat silent for the rest of the day. The lunchtime crowd never came. Each empty table screamed, louder than the last. And all the while, the envelope in Tom's pocket burned like a curse, forcing him to face a choice that could redefine everything. Across town, Michael Carter sat before a gathering of community leaders. The air in the room was thick with frustration and hope as Michael spoke, his voice steady, but charged with conviction. "What happened to my father wasn't an isolated act," he said. "It's the reflection of something deeper, something rotten in our community. But we have a chance here to turn his humiliation into something transformative." Asterisk, an older woman, head of the local NAACP chapter, leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing, Senator?" Michael's smile returned, calm but unshakable. "We're going to buy Tom's diner." The room buzzed with confusion and surprise. "Buy it? What? Why would we want to own that place?" someone demanded. Asterisk, Michael's eyes swept the room, his tone resolute. "Because we're going to reinvent it. Not as a relic of division, but as a beacon of unity. A gathering place that represents progress, not prejudice. A symbol that will stand in the heart of this town long after the old hatreds fade." Asterisk, as Michael laid out his vision, the air in the room shifted. Doubt melted into intrigue, and intrigue soon into excitement. Faces that had been wary only moments before now lit with possibility. His plan was bold, but more importantly it was contagious. Meanwhile, miles away, John Carter sat silently on his porch, staring into the fading twilight. The past few days had dredged up ghosts he thought he had long buried. He shut his eyes in an instant, the years peeled away. He was back in the sweltering jungles of Vietnam, the air thick with smoke and fear. Gunfire crackled in the distance. And beside him stood Tom Harris Sr., his comrade, his brother in arms. Together they had fought, clung to survival in a world unhinged by madness. But then came that day. It's the day everything splintered. John saw him again, the terrified young recruit, barely a man, dark-skinned and fresh from basic training. Fear had gripped the boy's hands, and in a single panicked mistake, lives were lost. Among them, the dearest friend of Tom Harris's R. Grief hardened into rage. Rage curdled into hatred. John had watched with horror as his friend's heart blackened, unable to distinguish between the actions of one frightened soldier and the skin color of an entire people. Tom Sr. let bitterness take root. Blind to the truth John could see so clearly, that the real enemy was not the boy, not his race, but the cruel, grinding machine of war itself. Now, opening his eyes to the present, John felt a wave of sorrow. The puzzle fit together at last. Tom Jr.'s prejudice was no mystery. It was an inheritance. Pain passed like a curse from father to son. But knowing its origin didn't excuse it. If anything, it made the need clearer. The cycle had to be broken, or it would consume yet another generation. Back in town, the diner was quiet, its neon sign flickering weakly in the night. Tom Harris was locking up when a sharp knock rattled the glass door. He looked up, and there stood Michael Carter. Tom's first instinct was to turn away, to pretend he hadn't seen. But something in Michael's eyes stilled him. A heavy sigh escaped his chest as he unlocked the door. "We're closed," Tom muttered, his voice edged with weariness. "I know," Michael replied softly. "I'm not here for a meal. I'm here to talk." Reluctantly, Tom stepped aside. The diner was empty, but the air between them was thick with history and unspoken bitterness. "I know about the offer you received." Michael began without hesitation. Tom stiffened, shock flickering in his eyes. How could you? Doesn't matter, Michael cut in. What matters is what you're going to do about it. Tom's shoulders sagged. His voice cracked. I don't know. This place. It's all I've got left. It's my father's legacy. Michael's expression softened, though his words struck like a blade. Is it really the legacy you want to honor? A legacy built on hate and division? The words stung. But deep down, he knew they were true. For the first time, he dared to ask himself, had his whole life been spent protecting not a heritage, but a prison? What do you want from me? Tom whispered, almost afraid of the answer. Michael stepped closer, his gaze steady, unwavering. I want you to choose, Mr. Harris. Choose to be better than your father. Choose to end the hatred before it devours someone else. Choose to begin again. In Michael's eyes, Tom did not see judgment, nor condemnation, only a flicker of hope. And that flicker pierced through the fortress he had built around his heart. Something inside him shifted, fragile yet undeniable. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine change. He didn't know it yet. But this decision, the one he would make tonight, would ripple far beyond his own life. The course of an entire town would bend on the weight of his choice. The next morning, as sunlight spilled across Main Street, Tom Harris stood outside his diner, keys trembling in his hand. The smell of coffee and fried eggs still clung to the air, the echoes of his childhood whispering through the walls. He could almost hear his father's voice teaching him how to flip pancakes. Long before bitterness had poisoned those memories, he walked to the office in the back, sat heavily in the chair that creaked under his weight, and pulled the offer letter from his desk drawer. His fingers traced the words one last time. Then, with a breath that shook, he picked up the phone. This is Tom Harris, he said, his voice rough, thick with emotion. I'm calling about the diner. I accept. The phone clicked back into place. A flood of relief washed over him, tinged with grief, but also with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Across town, Michael's phone buzzed. He read the message and smiled faintly. It's done, he told his father over breakfast. Tom accepted. John Carter leaned back slowly, eyes clouded with thought. And now, Michael's smile widened. Now, Dad. Phase 2. We turn that diner into something that heals instead of divides. A place where this community finally comes together. And over the next weeks, whispers stirred across town, whispers of change, of something new rising from the ashes of the past. The news spread like wildfire. Tom Harris had sold his diner. Within hours, the entire town was buzzing with speculation. Some whispered about a looming corporate takeover by a big restaurant chain. Others claimed it was being flipped into a sleek, overpriced coffee shop. But the truth, when it finally emerged, was far stranger and far more shocking than anyone had imagined. On a golden Saturday morning, a curious crowd gathered outside the newly renovated diner, craning their necks to glimpse what lay beyond the freshly painted facade. At precisely noon, the heavy doors swung open, and gasps rippled through the assembly. There, framed by the doorway with a confident yet humble smile, stood John Carter. Welcome, everyone, his voice rang out, steady and full of conviction. Welcome to the veterans table. Stunned murmur rose from the crowd. John Carter, the very man who had been humiliatingly thrown out of this very diner only weeks before, was now standing as its owner. With a gracious nod, he stepped aside, inviting the townsfolk to step inside and see what he had built. What awaited them was nothing short of a transformation. The once drab walls now glowed with life, lined with photographs and artifacts from generations of soldiers, men and women of every race, every background. The booths were upholstered in deep navy blue, their fabric echoing the dignity of military uniforms. And at the far end of the room, dominating the space, was a breathtaking mural. It showed a group of soldiers, diverse and resolute, standing shoulder to shoulder, faces etched with courage and camaraderie. At the mural's heart were two young men, one black, one white, arms locked across each other's shoulders. The resemblance to a young John Carter and Tom Harris Sr. was unmistakable. As the townspeople marveled, John stepped into the center of the diner. His voice carried emotion, but also steel. This diner has stood in our community for decades, he said, but for too long it was also a monument to division, to prejudice. Today that changes. Today it becomes a place of unity, of understanding, and of healing. The room stilled as he explained his vision. The veterans' table would be more than a restaurant. It would be a gathering place, a hub for veterans to find support, and a space for people from every walk of life to sit together, eat together, and learn from one another. Events would be held regularly to foster dialogue, break barriers, and heal wounds that had scarred generations. Faces in the crowd softened. Some nodded in agreement, others quietly wiped away tears. The air inside the diner shifted, swelling with something that hadn't been felt in a long time: hope. But John wasn't done. And now, he said, turning toward the kitchen, I'd like to introduce you to our new head chef. The crowd collectively held its breath as the kitchen doors swung open. Out stepped Tom Harris. The very man who had once embodied the diner's prejudice now stood in a crisp chef's uniform, shoulders hunched, eyes cast downward as though awaiting judgment. Slowly, he raised his gaze, facing the stunned crowd. I know, he began, his voice trembling. I'm the last person you expected to see here, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. What I believed, what I did, was wrong. Deeply, terribly wrong. His voice steadied. But John Carter and his son Michael gave me a chance I never earned, a chance to learn, to grow, to change. And I promise you I will spend every day proving that I can be better than I was. Heavy silence filled the diner. Then, somewhere in the back, a single pair of hands began to clap. Another joined, then another, till the room thundered with applause. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was recognition of courage, and the first fragile step toward redemption. John returned to the floor, his voice resonating above the applause. This is what the Veterans Table stands for: second chances, healing old wounds, building a better future together. With that, he declared the diner officially open. The rest of the day unfolded like the dawn of a new era. Strangers, who had never exchanged more than a stiff nod, now sat together, swapping stories across plates of food. Conversations sparked where silence had reigned for decades. The town was shifting, one shared meal at a time. Tom worked tirelessly in the kitchen, surrounded by a diverse team he once would have dismissed outright. Each dish he prepared, each smile he earned, chipped away at the burden he had carried. For years, the first time in a long, dark while, Tom Harris felt hope flicker in his chest. Across the room, John and Michael Carter stood quietly, watching their vision take root. "Do you think it will work, Dad?" Michael whispered. John smiled, eyes glinting. "It's a start, son. Sometimes, that's all it takes to change the world." In the weeks and months that followed, the Veterans Table became more than just a diner. It became a symbol of transformation. Events sparked tough conversations. Bridges were built where there had once been walls. The community began to heal in ways many had thought impossible. Tom kept his word. Day after day, he worked to earn back trust. He listened, he learned. And slowly, painstakingly, he changed. People began to see him less as the bitter man he had been, and more as living proof that redemption was possible. Word spread beyond the town. News outlets carried the story of the diner reborn, and the man reborn with it. A documentary crew even approached John and Michael, eager to share their story with the wider world. But the most unforgettable moment came. Nearly a year after the grand reopening, Tom Harris, Sr., frail, wheelchair-bound, and living in a distant nursing home, was brought to visit. When John wheeled him inside, the old man's eyes widened in disbelief. He saw the mural, the diverse crowd, his son, laughing and working alongside those he once despised. And for the first time in decades, the hardened veteran's eyes filled with tears. "I was wrong," he whispered hoarsely, clutching John's hand. "All these years I was so wrong." That day, in the warmth of the Veterans Table, wounds spanning generations began to heal. Tom Harris Sr. spoke not with bitterness, but with a humbled honesty about fear, about chaos, about the shared humanity of soldiers on all sides. And in that diner, surrounded by strangers who were no longer strangers, the community realized something profound. Healing wasn't just possible. It had already begun, as the sun dipped below the horizon. Painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, John Carter stood silently outside the diner. His eyes lifted toward the freshly painted sign that now read the Veteran Table. For a moment, he let the weight of the journey settle over him, the wounds of the past, the bruises of struggle, the nights thick with doubt. Every battle, every scar, had led them here. To this transformation, through the diner's glowing window, John could see Tom Harris Sr. animatedly sharing his story. Around him sat veterans from every walk of life, young and old, scarred by different wars but united by one bond. Their eyes followed him, not with judgment, but with understanding. Words of encouragement filled the air like a healing balm. A sudden warmth touched John's shoulder. He turned to find Michael standing beside him, pride glimmering in his son's eyes. "You did it, Dad," Michael whispered. "You changed everything." John's lips curved into a soft smile as he shook his head. "No, son, we did it. Of us together." Neither of them could have foreseen the ripple effect that small diner would ignite. The story of the Veteran Table was not closing. In truth, it was only beginning, chapter destined to stretch far beyond their small southern town. The very next morning, as John prepared to open the doors, the phone rang. On the line was a producer from a national news network. They wanted to feature the Veteran Table to showcase the unlikely transformation it had sparked. John hesitated. Fame had never been his pursuit. He wasn't interested in recognition. But then he considered what their story might awaken in others. Slowly, resolutely, he agreed. When the news crew arrived, the town seemed to shiver with anticipation. Crowds gathered on sidewalks, whispering, craning necks for a glimpse of cameras and bright lights. Inside, John sat at a booth as the mural of diverse soldiers loomed behind him, an unspoken reminder of sacrifice and unity. His voice, calm yet powerful, carried through the room. He spoke of the painful incident that had started it all, the venom of discrimination, and the decision that had changed everything, choosing compassion over rage. "It would have been easy to respond to hate with hate," John said steadily, "but that would have chained us to the same cycle. Instead, we chose love and healing." Then the camera turned to Tom Harris. His hands trembled as he spoke, but his voice grew steadier with each word. "I was raised to believe things I now know were wrong," he admitted, eyes brimming with tears. "It took John and Michael's grace to wake me up. I can't erase who I was, but I can fight every day to become someone better." One by one, townsfolk shared how the diner had reshaped them, dissolving divides they once thought permanent. Strangers who never would have spoken now sat together at tables, bonded by humanity. Even the reporter, her professionalism straining against emotion, leaned forward and asked John what message he hoped the world would take away. John paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want people to know change is possible. Even against generations of prejudice, hearts can shift. It's slow, it's hard, but with patience, empathy, and the courage to see the human being in front of you, we can build something better." The crew finally packed their equipment. A hush of expectation filled the diner. Everyone knew that once this story aired, life would never be the same, and they were right. On Sunday evening, the feature played on primetime television. Millions watched, spellbound by the tale of a broken town stitched back together by compassion. Social media erupted. Phones at the network blazed nonstop. Overnight, the Veteran Table trended across the country soon. The diner overflowed not just with curious travelers who drove days to see it, but with leaders and activists desperate to replicate the miracle. Calls and emails poured in. John and Michael found themselves answering pleas from across the nation, towns yearning for healing, cities fractured by old wounds, communities searching for hope. The impact grew larger still. Filmmakers approached, determined to capture the story not only of the diner, but of prejudice shattered, forgiveness embraced, and reconciliation made real. Cameras followed John, Michael, and Tom as they revisited those first painful days. Memories stung, old wounds reopened. But with every retelling, their resolve deepened. They realized then what they had built wasn't just a diner. It was a movement, and this was only the beginning. The documentary crew shadowed them for months, capturing not just the rhythm of the diner, but the heartbeat of an entire town in transition. Cameras rolled through dawn coffee rushes, late-night cleanups, community events that filled the place with music and laughter, and private moments of quiet healing. Veterans who once carried invisible wounds now found refuge at the veterans' table. And locals, some who had once dismissed or even resisted the change, spoke candidly of how their perceptions had been reshaped. One of the most unforgettable interviews came with Tom Harris Sr., the elder Harris. His body was frail, but his mind sharp as glass. He spoke with a raw honesty that stunned even the filmmakers. Carried anger for decades, he admitted, his voice trembling yet steady. One violent moment in war became the lens through which I judged an entire people. But here with my son and John, I've seen something I never thought possible. Love, forgiveness, brotherhood, I only wish I hadn't wasted so many years learning what should have been obvious. As the film neared completion, whispers spread word, of mouth turning into anticipation. Major festivals reached out, distributors circled, some even whispered the word Oscar. But for John, Michael, and Tom, awards were irrelevant. Their true reward came in quieter forms, in the faces of townspeople who carried themselves lighter, in veterans who smiled again, in strangers who told them their story had sparked hope. One evening, after another grueling day of filming, John sat at the counter of the empty diner, the smell of coffee lingering in the air. The neon sign hummed faintly outside. Tom was finishing up in the kitchen while Michael sat nearby, papers spread before him. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Then John spoke. Asterisk, you know, he said softly, staring into his cup. When all this began, I never imagined it would lead us here. Michael looked up, smirking. You mean you didn't plan on becoming the face of community healing and racial reconciliation? John laughed, shaking his head. Hardly. I just wanted to prove that love could be stronger than hate. Tom emerged, wiping his hands on a towel, his eyes sweeping the diner. And look what that small act of courage created, he said quietly. You didn't just change lives, John, you changed mine. John clasped Tom's shoulder. We've all changed, brother. That's the beauty of it. None of us walks this road alone. They sat there. Three men who had once stood on opposite sides of a chasm, now bound by something deeper than blood or history. None of them knew that their journey was only beginning, that the documentary would hurl their story onto the world stage and spark movements they never could have imagined. But for now, in that quiet diner, the weight of their shared journey felt like a sacred truth. Asterisk, the premiere came weeks later in New York City. A packed theater, flashbulbs, a red carpet they never dreamed they'd walk. Inside, civil rights leaders, industry elites, and journalists filled the seats. Asterisk as the lights dimmed. The film opened with the raw diner confrontation, unfiltered, inescapable. Gasps echoed through the crowd. But as the story unfolded, showing the slow unraveling of hate and the rebuilding of trust, the atmosphere shifted. By the final frame, there was not a dry eye in the room. Thunderous applause shook the theater. When John, Michael, and Tom stepped onto the stage for the Q&A, they were met with a standing ovation. John, one viewer asked, voice wavering, how did you find the strength to forgive? John paused. The silence stretched, heavy and reverent. Forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It's choosing not to let hatred devour you. It's seeing humanity in those who've hurt you. It's hard, but if we want to move forward, it's the only way. Another hand rose. And Tom, what would you say to those who still cling to the hatred you once carried? Tom gripped the podium, his knuckles white. I'd tell them hate is poison, blinds you to beauty, to love, to life itself. I wasted years drowning in it. Don't. Repeat my mistake. Open your heart before it's too late. The documentary's release sparked wildfire. Picked up by a major streaming service, it reached millions' living rooms, classrooms, boardrooms. Across the world, conversations began about race, reconciliation, healing. But its greatest impact was felt at home. In the months after, the Veterans Table became something almost sacred, a pilgrimage site. Strangers from across the country traveled just to sit at that counter, to eat a meal where love had triumphed over hate, to be part of a story that reminded them what humanity could be when it chose compassion over division. Visitors began arriving from miles, some even flying in from abroad, drawn not just by the aroma of home-cooked meals, but by the intangible atmosphere of acceptance and healing that had blossomed inside the little diner. What had started as a gathering place for veterans was now being whispered about as something more: a sanctuary, a symbol. Before long, John, Michael, and Tom found themselves in demand at conferences and summits on community building and racial reconciliation. Standing before packed halls, they retold their unlikely story, insisting each time that what had happened in their small town wasn't a miracle, but proof that with commitment and compassion, any community could change. Meanwhile, the diner itself kept evolving. So many new faces arriving daily, they expanded operations but refused to let growth water down their mission. Veterans remained at the heart of it all. One bold new idea turned into a resounding success: a mentorship program pairing veterans with at-risk youth. The results were astonishing. Young people discovered guidance and belonging, while veterans rediscovered purpose, dignity, and hope. As months passed, the influence of the Veterans Table began rippling outward in ways none of them could have predicted. Inspired by their story, other communities, tiny Midwestern towns, bustling coastal cities launched their own versions of the diner. Strangers who once stood divided now sat across from each other, sharing meals, sharing stories, daring to heal. Then came a call that stopped John in his tracks. It was from a prominent national civil rights organization. They had seen the documentary and were deeply moved. They wanted John, Michael, and Tom to speak at their annual conference, a gathering of some of the most influential voices in racial justice. When the day arrived, walking through corridors lined with portraits of civil rights icons, John felt as though he were straddling two worlds: the humble diner, where it all began, and this towering stage of history. Their presentation that afternoon was raw, humbling, and unforgettable. The audience leaned forward with every word, then rose in thunderous applause when the organization's president delivered his verdict. "What you've done is more than admirable. You've shown this nation that even the deepest wounds can heal. You've given us a roadmap." Moments later, the organization announced a new national initiative modeled after the Veterans Table itself to foster community healing across the country. And John, Michael, and Tom were asked to serve as advisors. The announcement sent shockwaves through the media. Reporters descended on their town, eager to capture reactions. But inside the diner, life carried on. Veterans still gathered at their familiar booths. Families still came to eat, laugh, and reconcile. And Tom, the man who once personified the town's prejudice, continued his quiet but powerful journey of redemption. One dusky evening, John found Tom standing in front of the mural, eyes clouded with thought. "Penny for your thoughts?" John asked gently. Tom's voice was low. "I was thinking about my father, about how proud he might have been, and how sad he wasted so many years in anger." John placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your father's story, just like yours, is proof that change is always possible. That's part of why this place matters." At that moment, the diner door creaked open. "Oh!" Michael burst in, his face alight with barely contained excitement. No. In his hand was a letter. "You're not going to believe this," he said, waving it in the air. "We've been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize." The words seemed to hang in the air, surreal and almost impossible. John and Tom stared at each other, stunned. A diner, their diner, was being considered for one of the highest honors in the world. Michael read aloud. This nomination recognizes your groundbreaking work in community healing and racial reconciliation. You have provided a model for addressing deep societal divisions in a peaceful, transformative way. For a moment, the three men stood speechless. Pride, humility, and disbelief surged through John in equal measure. Finally, he smiled faintly. "Well," he said, "I suppose we'd better get back to work. It looks like we still have a lot of healing to do." Michael chuckled at his father's understated reaction, and Tom nodded with quiet conviction. Night as they locked up the diner, the weight of their journey pressed down on them, but so did the light of what lay ahead. From one small act of forgiveness, a movement had taken root. The veterans' table was no longer just a diner. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of redemption, and a reminder of what could happen when ordinary people chose compassion over division as they stepped into the quiet night. The neon sign glowed behind them, casting a warm light into the darkness, a symbol of the healing they had sparked and the uncaptors still waiting to be written in. America's long story toward unity and understanding, and it had all begun with one choice: forgiveness. What about you? If you were in John Carter's shoes, would you have found the strength to forgive and build something so transformative? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story stirred you, the next one I've picked will move you even more. Don't miss it.